the town feels that it is a social ill, then it should probably just be a regular ordinance, just like, I can't go bring 30-06 on Main Street and start shooting guns in the air after the election, And so we viewed that kind of development as consistent with the zone on Putney Road, because whether we like it or not, that's the reality of development up there, and thought it inappropriate to try to achieve a social goal through land use ordinances. So,
did you want to, although David's not here, address some of his issues?
Is it okay if I address those when he comes back?
Sure.
I feel kind of sneaky
Just
doing it like
make
this.
sure I remind you, Dora.
Well, I just want to say in response to what Ken said, there actually are a number of things in this chapter which are really good things, which lay out doing things differently and lay out ways in which that you can do stuff. One of the things, when I spoke earlier about the disconnect between certain chapters, I feel like it's this dance we do in this town where the people with money and power want a particular kind of development and want a particular thing, which we haven't gotten for at least 20 years. But yet they're still stuck on wanting to have that kind of development. And they don't want to hear from some of the other things which actually could be really good business opportunities and really good ways of this town creating economic development. And so there are lots of all kinds of creative industries. There's smaller things. We don't need Home Depot. We can break that space down and have light industry all over the place, which would actually be good paying jobs and produce things which we might actually use in this community. That's an idea which is laid out in here, and it's laid out in other places, and it's laid out in a lot of other places when we're talking about sustainable development. So I don't think that it's not that we're promoting an idea. It's one piece. It's one piece of the pie, and I disagree with you, James, about it being just a social policy, because it does. I mean, the research shows that it has real economic impacts. And I think, I agree with David about the idea, because I was arguing with this when you were just saying we advise that it does this, and now all of a sudden the town plan says we rescind it. And that concerns me, that we're not having the dialogue before we actually go and change zoning ordinances. And so I agree with what David said about that being in the town plan, because it needs to be taken up case by case. But the 65,000 square foot thing, there really are real economic impacts, and I don't think we've had some developers say, it inhibits development, but we haven't had any data that says that that's actually true. And or if the development that we're having is something that's actually really going to bring that much money into town, or is it going to take all the money out of town? I don't,
Well, I don't think that the 65,000 square foot issue in reference to protectionism, we need to protect the businesses on Main Street. I always laugh that we have, I think, 22 gas stations in town. I mean, that is laughable. And the gas prices, there isn't a price fluctuation between more than 3 or 2 cents. And so competition doesn't drive the price down. And it's always interesting to say if somebody wants to open a gas station, we have how many pharmacies in town? And do the price of drugs, are they really different from one to another? They're not. But we use the competition factor to say we need this building, we need this storefront here because it's going to drive the price down. So I would have somewhat side with Mr. Valenti's comment in terms of a social policy. And like I said before, I did support this somewhat reluctantly. And, you know, economic growth, it's about venture capital. That Home Depot space, it's vacant. And they're looking to get out of paying the lease that they have to 2026, I think is the date, somewhere around that, and certainly would be happy to sign a lease to that extent if someone wants to go in there and subdivide that for small industry or whatever you feel you can create a living from. So opportunities, I think that we have to knock down some of the barriers that we have here and not worry about protectionism. We need jobs in our community. And if anybody wasn't paying attention last week when the governor was down here with Commonwealth Yogurt, that's been the largest growth in my 7 years on the board, that in 2 years they're going to be up to employing 140 people. And when they came before us and we did a tax stabilization agreement with them, we were talking about 25 jobs. That's growth. And that's a business that's good for not only our community, but good for the farmers in Vermont. Our growth has been actually in dairy. When you look at the Grafton cheese. So our growth has been limited, and where it has grown has been in the dairy sector. So I still believe that I'm in support of what the Planning Commission has proposed here in terms of removing this. Christopher?
Yeah, on that subject, I guess I would encapsulate what I want to say is you've got to watch out what you wish for. 65,000 feet could be taken up by a number of industries. I've seen some big success stories of companies that we would hate to lose, who have enormous footprints in the area. And I'm thinking in particular of New Chapter. And I'm thinking of another industry that we really don't have much of here, even though a lot of our economy is transportation-based, with wholesale distribution. I see there is wholesale trade in here. I don't know if that's the same thing.
Yes.
But it is. Oh, good. I'm thinking of two industries two examples of one industry in particular we don't really have here, but which do relate to online trade. I'm thinking first of in a bigger example is LL Bean. Here's a company with a nationwide and worldwide presence that is famous for quality and has just keeps doing better and better every year. Located of all places on the coast of Maine. Now you'd think, well, that really defies logic. You'd think that a major distribution organization would want to take up residence in Kansas or Nebraska or someplace in the middle of the country. Not so. Homegrown business that is associated with where it came from. And another one, more close to home, is the Vermont Country Store. You walk into the two country store outlets that exist, the one in Weston and the one in Rockingham, and they have some really nice things, but that's not really where the money is made. The money is made in Manchester from their distribution center, which is enormous and has a lot of jobs. And if we had a 65,000 square foot rule that somebody had to trip over or leap over or negotiate around, we could find ourselves at a disadvantage when a decision is made where to locate something like that. Now, these things don't come along every day, we know that. But when they do come along, they stick around and they're good jobs. Would we have been accommodating successfully a New Chapter when they started out, or Vermont Bread Company when they started out and needed to expand? Could they have stayed here if there was a 65,000 square foot rule? I wonder. So, yes, I can understand the groundswell of opposition to what's stated here, but honestly, watch out what you wish for, because you could find yourself turning away some wonderful opportunities in industries that are quite attractive. So.
I don't think we really have any, I mean, I'm only speaking for myself, but there was nothing I wanted to respond to.
You can ask one
Until
more
David
thing.
returns.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have just another minor thing. You've got a, sorry?
That's
what I
funny.
missed.
It's a David Gardenstein joke. Go ahead.
All right.
They're funny.
Okay. On page 12, and you've got a very handy table here that's quite informative. Could I ask that you put in something that shows what the cumulative inflation has been, so that when you see a number like on line 1, total covered all ownerships, change from 2000 on the far right is 22.5. What is the cumulative inflation number to compare that with? I think that'd be really helpful to make those numbers really tell a story. Because some of these, one thing that's really interesting from this chart is that you've got the absolute number of jobs in employment down significantly, and total wages, fluctuate here, but average wage across the board is increased very materially with the exception of wholesale trade. But I just don't know what to compare those numbers with when it comes to cost of living. So if you could put in a good inflation number there, I think that would be really helpful. To compare those right-hand column numbers.
Yeah, I should say, Chris, that I don't think that these are adjusted for inflation. They're
Right.
not. But the inflation rate, the cumulative inflation rate in general from 2000 to 2010 is on an annual basis of under 3%. So inflation is somewhere in the vicinity of 26 to 30% for the 10-year period.
Okay, so that would really make these numbers tell you a bigger story. For example, that broadcasting except internet up 47%.
Right.
That's a meaningful number, but then you've got another number, accommodation and food services would be flat in terms of
Exactly.
the
So
average wage.
And so where you see after you've adjusted for inflation that the number is significantly higher, you can interpret that as competition for those positions, and basically that the market's willing to pay more for that labor, or that industry is earning greater profits than those sectors that are flat. And most of the service sector is flat, and there's a strong correlation between education and training and increases in income above the rate of inflation.
Yeah, so would it be any trouble to put in
No.
that number?
I mean, I think, we can figure it out. So
Yeah,
it's
great.
fine.
Thank you.
That'd be good.
Dora?
Just one thing, just to make sure members of the public and television audience, the 65,000 square foot ordinance is for only retail. It's not for industrial or other uses.
Thank you.
So, and I'm looking at the members of the public out there, and I'm seeing a lot of glassy-eyed people, and I'd really love to hear from them. We don't have any more. We talked about going chapter by chapter, Dick, in the beginning, in case you...
We're on chapter 1.
We're in chapter 1.
Thank you for
It's
that.
actually not
Two, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Right side, it's 2.
We are on chapter 2.
The first
Actually-
standard.
Oh, yes, chapter 1 is, yes.
Actually, that was a concern that I had today when I talked with Rod Francis, and believing that we were going to get through this all this evening. Fat chance. I believed that, I thought that we would probably, if I was here at the beginning, that we would go till at least 9:30, and then probably have to recess. Effectiveness kind of goes out the window after about 2.5 hours, and focus is lost. So we will march on. I think what I'll do is, at this point, we'll see if anyone from the public wants to add anything in terms of chapters 1 and 2 here. And Adam? You deferred to Kate. Okay, there you go.
Kate Anderson, Brattleboro. I'd like to go back to a comment that Dora made with regard to the arts and economic development. So probably the last thing in the world I want to do is argue against the word arts. However, I would say that the arts are probably understood as a subset of the creative industries. That's a term that, in my research, is used as inclusive of the arts. That said, if it's not a major change, perhaps the word arts could come in there with creative industries. I'm half an hour late for a rehearsal, and I would love to just read something I wrote today which is in overview of the town plan. It's very short. I'd like to say sometimes I am astonished at the richness of this community. When newspapers are failing everywhere, we support too, as well as online citizens reporting. We hold dozens of meetings on every imaginable topic. The citizenry is not only well-informed, but then eager to discuss that information. The town plan serves to inventory and envision Brattleboro. It maps and identifies what we are and gives voice to what we want to be known as and for. The Smithsonian Magazine listed Brattleboro as number 11 of the 20 best American small towns. The article focused largely on the arts. But the arts owe a debt to the authenticity of this community, evidenced by a town that can produce a plan such as this. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam?
I'm Adam Hubbard. I live on Spruce Street, and I have a fair amount to say, but I'll try to make it quick and do my best at that. First, I want to say this is an impressive plan, it's an impressive document, and it should be noted I echo Ken's concern about the effort versus the critique, but still, I will critique as well. I would also like to just take note of Brattleboro as quite a special place and quite well positioned to develop in the future. When we talk about energy efficient land use, Brattleboro has all the components we're looking for in terms of a range of services, transportation, and a condensed environment with mixed use. And I think that is really important to note and really important to carry forward. I would also like to take note of something that Liz said about the demographics and the slow rate of growth or no growth of Brattleboro. I see this as a very critical item, as other people have mentioned. What is not mentioned is the regional growth in towns around us that have grown in the last 40 years. And what has happened is that, as I noted here, that 30% of the employees or workers in Brattleboro live in Brattleboro. And I expect that to change in the future. That's an unsustainable ratio. And the way we can make that change is to make Brattleboro a more livable place. And one way to make Brattleboro a more livable place is look to the past. Look to what pattern we developed as prior to zoning. We talk about the different areas of town that had plans developed. And the one area of town that hasn't had a plan developed could arguably say is the most successful, and that is downtown. It has the least need for zoning. It's fully built out. It's fully mixed use. It had high tech in a church and a pharmacy in a church, and it's really a very organic fabric downtown. And we should trust that. We shouldn't try to control it and replicate it outward. So that said, I would like to make some notes on this is about the economic chapter, and I'll take advantage of this one line about lot size in the economic chapter and industrial lot size being raised. And I think that would be a critically important flaw to carry that forward. When you reduce a increase of industrial lot size from 22,000 square feet to 3 acres, you are in effect making somebody who wants a 10,000 square foot shop to buy more land than they need. So this pattern we'll see carried forward in the land use chapter as terms of how you encourage rich development. And in my opinion, encouraging rich development means allowing people to develop in a way that they see fit with proper guidance and proper input. Regulating lot sizes and dimensional standards is the most awkward process we all have been through. We know it, but we still feel compelled to control the use and the dimensions of how people develop. I can tell you that the street I live on is a terrific street. It would be a street you'd like to model up and down throughout the country, and it was developed without zoning. Keep that in mind, please. The other thing I would like to take note of in the economic section is 2 industries that I feel could use a little notation. And I did see healthcare noted, but I really think Brattleboro could become a center. Also looking backward to its water cure days, but looking forward, the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital scored very highly in consumer reports. The Brattleboro Retreat, new chapter, and this incredible network of healthcare providers, of alternative and conventional together, is really an excellent resource that we need to provide to the wider community. I just want that to be noted. I would also say that forestry needs special notation. Lord knows, as a developer or in the world of land development, I've seen the Srisasimo Industries do some things around the state that I would not be proud of, but I thank Srisasimo Industries for what they provide to this town. And in tandem with that, Allied Lumber and all these loggers. I used to get very grumpy about the logging trucks rolling down through Main Street. But Lord knows, those are dollars moving in and out of this town. Those logs used to roll up to Canada. Having continuing support for forest industry and value-added products to this town brings money to town. That's the kind of economic development that we need. I also want to just take 2 more minutes, sorry. I think it's really important to note how much investment has been made in this town. You know, I just sitting here, and hearing this conversation, Delta, Commonwealth, the Co-op, Cultural Intrigue, new chapter, New England New Theater, Hilltop Montessori, the addition to the high school, those are private, sorry. And then these sort of public institutions that have invested in the high school and the sewage treatment plant and the hospital and the Gibson-Aiken Center. These are real investments. When people are making real investments in your town, you will see real growth. We just need to encourage people to live here. My closing statement, I guess I would sort of refer to Ken's comment sort of piqued my interest about knocking something down and putting something back. And I would like to raise a counter to that in terms of regulation. Regulation and regulatory mechanisms have been incrementally increasing over time. There are 36 agencies, divisions, departments that any development might have to go through. Within that, there's a nested complex of criteria that stretch for hundreds of criteria. And it is incredibly difficult to develop anything. So I commend those that have, and I encourage everybody to knock some of that regulation back carefully.
Thank you.
I have my comments about minimum lot size and PUDs here.
Why don't you give that to...
Yeah, thank you, Adam. May I respond to that briefly, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you may.
Specifically, I wanted to respond about the 3-acre minimum change. It's currently 22,000 square feet in the industrial zone in Brattleboro. The reason we did that was not to condemn industrial businesses that might develop on small lots. The reason is because our industrial lots over time have been getting chopped up, and there are fewer and fewer large industrial lots. And our concern is that if there is continued subdivision, we won't have sufficient space in the industrial zone for companies who are looking for a larger parcel. It would be an imposition on them to find suitable land.
Like the next Commonwealth.
Like the next Commonwealth. And I just would note further that there are going to be a substantial amount of pre-existing small lots that will be grandfathered past a change of ordinance if it did happen. And this wouldn't immediately banish all those lots or force them to increase. There's potential space out there. So that was what I wanted to add to you. And I suppose just as a matter of general principle, although I agree with Mr. Hubbard about how the downtown developed without zoning, it also developed with its back to the water, and it's now almost impossible to get to the water. Putney Road was once beautiful farmland, and it was developed in a fairly haphazard way. And I agree with him that in the old days, people just seemed to develop their communities better, build their houses better, have more attention to aesthetics. But the reason we all got zoning was because sometime in the last 50 years, for whatever reason, it stopped. And in Vermont especially, controlling development has been a problem. And we've worked hard to zone to preserve our natural resources, our historic resources. And obviously, as the chair of the Planning Commission, I believe strongly in it, and I just wanted to communicate that.
Well, I just thanks, Adam, for your comments. I just want to say that the folks at that table will tell you that I was very hot and bothered by this whole industrial lot size increase in the beginning, and I did some investigation, and I was concerned both for what you were talking about, but also about the fact that we want small industries to develop, but also because of the worry about big industries that would be out of scale for the community. And then I did a little investigation, and I found out exactly how many industries actually had really large lot sizes. I went down to the lister's office and was checking in on what stuff, and then I thought, oh, okay, I guess it's not as big as I thought it was. So I could go either way on that, because I do feel this, I do have the same concern that you do.
I know that Tim had his hand up, but I'm going to get Brattleboro residents first and then people from out of town. So Brattleboro residents first. George, I saw you with your hand up before.
Thank you. I really want to understand this. The existing system that we have is one under which a threshold is envisioned, at which point, if a retail business is going to come in, we want to know what the effect is going to be on the community before we say that it's all right, and that threshold is 65,000 square feet. Is this correct?
Yeah.
And I understand that what is envisioned is that we will say we don't really care how big the business is. We're not really interested in finding out in advance what the effect is going to be on the economics of the community. And I think this depends on the idea that anything that comes into town and hires somebody is going to be good. I want to bring up two things that come to mind about this, one of which was many years ago there was a question of whether Walmart would be located in Brattleboro, and as I recall, but there was an investigation that happened at the time into what happens when a large store of that nature comes into town. What happens to the town? And one instance that was brought up was a town in which specifically Walmart moved into town, and it basically systematically killed every business on Main Street that it could compete with. And then, because the businesses on Main Street were going empty, it consistently killed all of the businesses that it could not compete with. And then it discovered that it wasn't making any money, so it left. And people in that particular community, which happened to be in Texas, discovered that they had to drive 75 miles to get a haircut. Another one, which was much more local, was Greenfield. And my recollection is that when Greenfield decided that it was going to allow large shopping centers to be developed, the center of Greenfield basically went dead and still has not completely recovered. Now, the idea that we bring a store into town and that it hires somebody and that is good, I think, is not necessarily the case. And so it makes sense that we should have a threshold at which we should say, by the way, if you're going to be this big, we really want to know what's going to happen to the town when you come in and when you do business and when you decide that Brattleboro isn't big enough for you, so you skip town after having done whatever it is you're going to do to the community. So, I mean, clearly, I'm kind of in favor of knowing in advance how these things are going to happen. My suspicion is that a company that's big enough to put up to get a 65,000 square foot business is probably able financially to justify doing research and supplying the results of that research to the community.
Thank you, George. Ken?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I think that certainly oversimplifies anything I was trying to say. And I wasn't really hearing anyone say that just because someone is hiring people that they're good. So that, to me, wasn't the point. I guess maybe I need to understand more, and maybe someone can explain the 65,000 number. That's not something that I understand. I certainly am not able to understand why 60,000, based on that argument, George, it would be that we're okay with someone with a store of 60,000 square feet and them not having to do an economic impact. But if they do that extra 5,000 and are at 65,000, then we need to be sure what devastating effects they might have on the community. So I guess I'm trying to understand, to me it's very much tied to, so why are we locked in on this is the size where we have determined as a town? It's one thing if we're talking about, so this is the type of establishment that we would want to do an economic impact. But this is about size. This doesn't actually say in here, this is the type of establishment where if they propose to come to our community, we would want them to do an economic impact. And I feel like some of the comments and what I was reading online today equated those two things. And that's not actually what this says. So I for me, am displaying my own ignorance. I guess I need to understand, because this is very much not my field, the 65,000 piece and why 60,000 is okay, no economic impact study, but 65,000 sure as hell better find out what they're going to do to the community.
Rod?
I wasn't around for the discussion and the implementation of this section of the zoning ordinance in 2006, but I have been here long enough to form some sense of the history of the issue. I guess the position of the Planning Commission and their position articulated in the town plan is, to put it in a nutshell, the town plan's focused on setting the appropriate parameters for growth that the community finds acceptable, primarily from a land use standpoint, and the impacts that are normally understood to come with a large-scale development. The Planning Commission now feels can be addressed through specific land use regulations, including Act 250 review. The question of whether the town should have an ordinance that, as you said, reviews a potential developer from the standpoint of the kind of business that they're offering or the size of it, we feel would be more appropriate as a town ordinance, and that the focus for land use controls should be on precisely that, land use controls. And so I think what's happened here is that two things got collapsed together at some point, where a negotiated size was roughly estimated and the impacts associated with that kind of store at that kind of size were used as a basis, and therefore that's what justifies the economic impact assessment. But I think your point is well made, that we don't scrutinize anyone at 63 or 64,999. It's the magic number of 65,000. The concerns that we have is that currently any store at 65,000 square feet or over has to be located on Putney Road. That's also part of the ordinance. And so what it does is give direction or instructions to a potential developer that narrow their options and narrow their uses, and it would include, for instance, Price Chopper seeking to expand their current site at Exit 1. That plaza, currently, that whole area, including the Blockbuster building, is 100,500 square feet. So, and the Price Chopper part of that is, that building that Price Chopper is about a third of is 91,000 square feet. So you can see pretty easily there that you get into these complicated scenarios where the developers are actually going to opt out of pursuing expansion or renewal strategies because of the limited nature of the way the ordinance is structured. All we're saying is that this is a land use control issue. We'd rather separate the land use control issues from any kind of work that was designed to establish the economic or social impacts of a large-scale retail facility. And the other part that underscored this is that when we had the consultant come and do the study on the commercial districts, the observation was made repeatedly that because of internet sales and a variety of other factors, the retail landscape has changed dramatically, and there's not necessarily great pressure to expand or add to the retail space in Brattleboro, but it is felt that the way the ordinance is currently written, even redevelopment projects for existing stores could be negatively impacted, and that was the basis for which the Planning Commission wanted it removed.
Because it's my understanding that based on internet sales and what I was trying to do my research today is that a lot of what we're calling big box stores, which again this doesn't call out, are actually leasing spaces that are far fewer than 65,000 because their internet sales are so great.
Yes.
So if we're having a conversation about the types of businesses we want to have in Brattleboro, the 65,000 doesn't necessarily mean the threshold that we're talking about, because a lot of these places are leasing much smaller buildings because they have such great internet.
Right.
Okay. So then I'm understanding these two they just got conflated into one.
Right, and so we don't
I'm
see
not
them
saying without
merit then, but they don't mesh very well given the realities of retail now and what the development needs in the view of the Planning Commission here are for Brattleboro as a whole.
Okay. I am.
Sure, hang on. Out in the, yes.
Hello, everybody. Tom Trencher, Spruce Street. I was the chair of this subcommittee of the Planning Commission several years ago. So I just want to see if I can take a few moments to focus this discussion, because I think we're getting a little bit far afield from what's in the town plan. There's a lot of philosophical comments here, wider issues. If, at some point the Planning Commission wants to bring up the general issue of these kinds of things, that seems to be a different issue. Right now, the issue with this town plan is simply, as I understand it, that there's one change of that section of the large-scale retail use taken away, and that's simply what's called there the economic assessment, economic impact assessment. And I'll get to that in a moment, because that's just really 5 things. That's really what's at issue here. Not the size. We're not talking about the size. That's not what's in the town plan. Maybe at some other point people want to reconsider that and look at it, but that's not what we're looking at right here. Dick, I'd like to reconvince you again, persuade you. And here's why. We have a reason to support the language as is, and you have it in this large 1.5-inch document called the town plan. There's several things in there. I'll name 2 or 3 things that support this. One is this idea, somewhere in this economic section, that promoting land, or I can't remember where this is, but there's a sentence in there that says promote land development that enhances the quality of life. Plus, later, it talks about what a lot of us really support, this idea of a genuine progress indicator, which, under the community development section, which really seeks to do exactly what this economic impact assessment seeks to do, which is to look at other things besides the traditional things that we would look at, such as traffic, other things that are more obvious. But these things are looking at real impact. other things that look at the overall quality of life in our community. So I think the town plan already has, what Ken mentioned, what are these ways. It already gives direction. So I see an inconsistency. If you take it out, it seems to me to be a little bit of a, using that as a scapegoat. We're worried about economic development, but I think we really have to look very carefully. I'd like to know, for instance, if this is a barrier or an impediment, how is it? Do we really know that? And I don't know if we have an answer to that. I haven't heard anything that suggests that there really is real, actual evidence that businesses don't come in here because of these 5 statements. They might not come because of Act 50, other kinds of things that are already in there that aren't a question. So I'd be interested. I'd also be concerned if we're, from a public hearing, that looking at this because of members of the business community having a perception that this is an impediment without really knowing whether it is. The nevertheless, that we don't really anticipate large-scale retail, nevertheless, is this, I find interesting. Why? As the chair of that committee, I'd just like to say very briefly, we did an extensive study. So I would just plead that you look at that, the work that's done by this committee over 2 years should have what we might call presumption and that's to change that, I would hope that we'd have a burden of proof because I don't see the rationale in here. The rationale in the land use section says simply that it's a hardship and it's an additional regulatory requirement, and then it mentions that's well served by transportation. A couple of the rationales seems to be focused on things like transportation, which was not a concern. Just a couple more comments, and then I'll close. And I'd be glad to share. I might have some of those old minutes. I have notebooks. I might still have them around if anybody's interested in them. These 5 things, let me just mention these briefly, because this goes to the heart of this. This is the only change that would be taken out in this town plan. 1, it simply asks that if somebody comes here and wants to build something over 65,000 square feet on Putney Road, they have to go through all these hoops. The only thing that just asks them is they go through one other hoop, that they do this study. And the study asks for 5 things. The overall impact of employment in the greater Brattleboro area. What's going to be the effect on employment? The estimated costs of public and social services. The impact on commercial and residential property values. The extent to which the project will contribute to or draw business from existing businesses in the greater Brattleboro area. And finally, estimates of how much revenue generated by the project will be retained and redirected into the local economy and region. All 5 are economic considerations, not social. All 5 have to do with the economic well-being of this community. So all it asks is that if you want to come in here and build a store, all we want to know, as George mentioned earlier, is this a net economic good to this community? And everything I've read in the town plan seems to support that. And I don't see anything in the town plan that would suggest to me that we want to take that out. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And I think I prefaced my comment as to say I don't know if this 65,000 square feet has been an impediment. And I'm willing to remove those requirements to see if there is interest in our community. I have, one of the things that you talked about, the 5 things that the study would look at, I have no idea what that would cost someone who wanted to come into our community.
We do.
I don't know if you do. Could you give me that figure?
Yeah, our understanding is it's basically a 6-month process that can cost anywhere from $35,000 to $50,000. And that's why we consider it a significant hardship. It may not be a lot of money on the level of development those usually entail, but 6 months sure as heck is, if you're talking about that level of income
Okay.
stream.
I've often wondered, and I've never asked that question. Tim, yes, Tim, the other Tim. No, you. You're still a Brattleboro resident.
Personality.
You're still.
Tim Cuthbertson, resident of Brattleboro, Western Avenue. I've got just a couple of things which, towards the end, might stray slightly from the economic chapter. The first is that, as current chair of the DRB, we have not had one single application that has caused us to use the economic assessment in 6 years. Since the ordinance has been in place, there has been no applications. In fact, it was a requirement for the DRB that we have 5 or 6 consultant firms that would be available to developers to select from to make these economic impact studies. In the 6 years that since the ordinance has been in place, actually I don't even now know whether the firms that were on the shortlist are even still current or valid. We've never had to use it once. So I would say that should there have been any company that wished to come in with a 65,000 square foot plus store, and that there may be none that wanted to come in, certainly as a disincentive, it succeeded because not one went through and proceeded with the economic impact study. The figure that they just raised of 30 to 50,000 at the initial stages to 2006, the number was a lot higher. We talked about $50,000 to $100,000 in 6 months worth of delay. And certainly the delay alone, as James just mentioned, is enough to have most companies just take Brattleboro off their list. They wouldn't even entertain it. There's one other thing in terms of economic impact or economic development that I want to talk about, and that's or to frame the changes in the land use section relating to the PUD process in an economic context. We're looking at inhibiting development in the town. The proposed changes to the PUD process certainly don't knock down the barriers to growth, business development, and I see them as closing out opportunity. I've had conversations with a number of people that are involved in the development process in town, lawyers and engineers, and the general consensus of opinion is if you had a client that came to you and was looking at going through a PUD process where a change of use was required in the district, they would recommend to their client they do not entertain considering that development in Brattleboro. So that's something that I think from an economic standpoint is very significant, because if we have our engineering firms and our firms of lawyers saying, don't even think about it, it's going to cost you too much, it's going to take too long, and the process is too arduous, we're closing the door unnecessarily to potential development. I'm sure that at some point the land use section comes up, that will get discussed probably a little further. And a case in point is that should the regulations as proposed have been in place, graft and cheese would not have been undertaken as a project. So we've said that we're expanding dairy, we've said that we've got, absolutely, graft and cheese require change of use. It's a very arduous process.
Oh, you're talking about PUD.
Could you,
PUD.
thank you. Could you respond to that?
Elizabeth's going to take this one.
Thank you.
Well, one of the main goals of this process was to streamline the regulations, and the changes proposed to the PUD do streamline the regulations, but there's several aspects to it. As it is now, a PUD is used as a tool for, as if the PUD was a use, and the developer goes in and the DRB discusses all manner of, not only the dimensional standards, but the use, and it's kind of, it doesn't give transparency to the developer or to the abutters, the people in the neighborhood going in. Now, the way that we propose to revise it is to say, we're going to make it easier for an applicant to develop a PUD so long as there isn't a change of use. And that means that everything stays within the Development Review Board for the large majority of applications that come before the board, but that we see the Planning Commission's role as land use related and policy setting board. And the Development Review Board reviews applications on a parcel-specific basis, on a case-by-case basis. So that if you want a change of use, that's something that is an intensive enough change that it really should go back to the Select Board and the Planning Commission, because it's a significant change and it affects the other land uses surrounding it. So let's say you have a property within a zone, let's say it's a residential zone, and you want a different use than the uses that are listed for that zone. Well, by its very nature, that's going to impact all the other existing, land uses in that zone that are listed in the zone. So it's a change, and it's much more significant than looking at the setbacks and the lot sizes and the lot coverage. Those are things that are typically reviewed in the development review process. But that the change of use, just that one aspect of this proposal, is of a nature of higher, that it should be kept with the people who have looked at the town as a whole and the land uses as a whole as they fit together in the zone, and shouldn't be on a case-by-case or ad hoc nature by the Development Review Board, because then the town wouldn't see that coming in. It wouldn't be as well publicized for the people next door and the abutters and so forth to understand and comment on. So that the majority of the changes to the PUD streamline it. They're what the Development Review Board has asked for. But in this one element, in terms of a change of use, we would like to keep essentially the way it is now, to have both the Select Board and the Planning Commission comment on just that one aspect, which is the change of use. And I think it speaks to what the Planning Commission is all about on the one hand, and what the Development Review Board is all about on the other hand.
Thank you.
I should just note that the PUD issue is discussed in Chapter 10 in great detail. And I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it now, but it's not really an economic development.
It's actually, I don't want to get way out in front of us, and actually probably gave Tim too much latitude there. So I'll make sure I won't do that again.
It is an economic impact issue.
I do understand that, yes. I see no other hands. Tim? And please state your name and the town that you're from.
Tim Stevenson from Athens, and I too was on the, I guess for lack of a better name, the box store subcommittee that existed between 2004 and 2006. I certainly concur with remarks that George, Tom, and Dora have made, and I'll try not to repeat them and just mention a couple of items. Dick, I'm sorry to hear that you're changing your mind. We counted on your vote in the past, and we're happy to get it. But I would argue that I don't think box stores are the solution to the very serious economic problems that you have in this town in terms of attracting people. In fact, all evidence would point to the contrary. I would strongly urge the Planning Commission, if you haven't done so already, to consult the voluminous literature on box stores, on large stores. And I think you'll find that the story is not good. They are the death of downtowns typically and of small businesses, and they have a lot of other problems, including, by the way, an increase in taxes because of the demand on social and public services that they typically have. I want to make a couple other comments, but I think what I'd like to do is to ask maybe Dick and the rest of the select board a question first, and that is if the language that is presently in the town plan that would eliminate the box store $65,000 ordinance, if that is accepted as is, does that language trump the present ordinance? Does that automatically put, okay.
No.
Well, can I address
I
that?
don't think
No,
so.
wait.
Go ahead.
I think the answer would be no. There's some disagreement here, but what would happen is the statute says that the ordinances should comply with the plan, that they should comport with it. So there would be some impetus to change the ordinance in a reasonable period of time to comply with the plan. If that didn't happen, if we attempted to make an ordinance that said no more economic development studies on 65,000 square foot parcels, then it would go to the select board. If the select board said this is a bad idea, we don't want to do it, and voted down, what the remedy there would be to amend the town plan. Something the select board can do by itself without us, by the way, if that happens.
Correct, Bobby?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay. David?
Well, I missed a half hour, 45 minutes. I'm
So did I.
sorry. You know, my jury was rendering its verdict, so I'm
With verdict
sorry
change.
that I wasn't here. But I did say before I left that I didn't really think this was the place to be making decisions about individual changes to the zoning ordinance. And I do think that inclusion of specific standards and guidelines in the town plan would then call for amendment of the zoning ordinance to comport with what's in the plan. So I really think these issues require further study. And that's just going to be something we're going to have to hash out as we decide on whether we're going to adopt the town plan in its form or with changes. I really didn't want to get particularly drawn into the debate about 65,000 square feet and the prevalence of, or the possibility of having box stores in the community. But it has always been my view. I was on the Development Review Board for 9 years. I watched this debate and this amendment to the ordinance go on. It's always been my view that at its core, the 65,000 foot restriction was a political decision. And I know there are those who were in favor of it, who might disagree, but it was always my view that this was a political statement in opposition to big box stores. And given the nature of development in our community as a whole, I question why it is that we would think that having a restriction like this in Brattleboro would somehow insulate us from the broader impact of these types of stores in the region. When people came to town meeting 2 weeks ago and said, don't impose any more sales tax, or don't impose any sales tax here, it was because of the fear that business was going to flee to other communities. It was going to flee to New Hampshire. It was going to flee to Greenfield. Any given day, when you need to do shopping for staples, if you go to Walmart, if you go to a box store in Keene, neighbors from Vermont are there. People from Brattleboro are there. People from everywhere in this community are there. Half of the license plates in the Walmart parking lot are from Vermont on any given day, and in the Target parking lot the same way. And the notion that we're going to insulate ourselves from the impact of big box stores by not allowing them here seems to me to be fanciful. I've never understood the reason that we think we can insulate ourselves in that way. I've never been in favor of the 65,000 square foot limitation. It's always seemed to me to be a political decision by those opposed to big box stores. Now, maybe we're going to adopt it as part of this or not, or change to it as part of this. I can't tell. But if we're talking about the 65,000 foot limitation, let's be frank about what happened, because that is what happened.
I would agree with you, Mr. Gartenstein, that it is a mixed bag at best. And I would agree with you that those of us that wanted to ban box stores altogether, much less have a $65,000 cap, were doing it for what you call political reasons. But they were based on not just something that came out of the sky one day. They were based on a lot of experience, and interestingly, a lot of the support for this came from people that had moved to Brattleboro or the greater Brattleboro area and had lived in other communities and had witnessed the destruction of box stores in those communities. So, you know, it's not a simple question. You're absolutely correct when you say that half the license plates in Walmart are from Vermont. I mean, after all, it's a simple trip across the bridge to make that trip. So I think it is a complex issue. But I would go on to argue that I do not think that box stores are our salvation by any question. And I would like to maybe just go on to make the one point that no one else has really made tonight that I really think is very germane to this whole discussion. One of the things that frustrates me when we get into discussion about the economic future is that I don't get the sense that people are looking at the future in terms of what we know about the present at the time. And that is that we have moved into, it's not future tense anymore, we have moved into a post-petroleum age. And when you talk about box stores, you're talking about a kind of business that is heavily dependent upon petroleum. There's no getting around it. Whether it's bringing those large containers over from China, whether it's those trucks that go running around the country, however you look at it, box stores are heavily dependent upon petroleum. And what I would hate to see is a community like Brattleboro get tied to a box store or two and go down with that ship that's going to go down. Those stores are not sustainable. They are not a sustainable way to base your economy. And I think that I feel like Brattleboro is in a very difficult position, Dick. I mean, I listened to you talk about this, and there's no way I can argue with you. How do you attract people to stay here? How do you attract businesses to come here? I feel that we have to become imaginative in this area and begin to deal with a newer paradigm that I think has been suggested by things that the Planning Commission has talked about, by remarks that have been made here tonight. The elephant out there on Putney Road that used to be known as Home Depot, making that into a building that could, into smaller buildings that could accommodate local businesses, that could maybe make products that could be sold to local people. That is the model that we're going to have to increasingly come to if we're going to be a community that's going to survive and sustain ourselves. We have to think of how we're going to be able to take care of ourselves. And the box stores are not going to do it. The large corporations are not going to do it.
And I would respond by telling you that we have, in terms of retail, we have $3 stores in our town. What does that say about our community?
Right.
And so when we're talking about economic development, impact, you're right, that Home Depot space. Home Depot didn't hurt Brown and Roberts. You know, people have, I always thought that, well, that place I think actually forced Brown and Roberts to start opening up on Sunday. Because people have problems and projects that they want to do that when you wanted to go to Brown and Roberts and support them, you couldn't because they were closed. So you went up to Home Depot.
Okay.
And Brown and Roberts did a better business once Home Depot opened up. So Home Depot didn't hurt anyone. It actually, I think, built the other stores to say we have a strong customer base.
They didn't hurt the other stores because fortunately we have a population in this burg that supports Brown and Roberts, that supports True Value, and that did not support Home Depot. Home Depot closed their doors within 4 years after being here. Why? Because they weren't getting the customers. And those customers, so that was the beauty of this town, is that, and that's another thing that I wonder if people take it into consideration. What's the population support in this town? Do they want box stores? Do they want large stores like that to come? They didn't back in 2006.
Yes. All right, Tim, I think that, Tim?
I'm through?
You're through.
Are you?
Well, I could go on, but
Well, I know that.
Ray is suggesting that perhaps I call it.
Maggie Bartenhagen, Town Plan Advisory Committee, and I'm a resident of Halifax, Vermont. And I just have to comment, after hearing Tim and some of the other things that have been said tonight, that just overall, I mean, I was intimately involved with the creation of this town plan just as an advisory member to it, and really witnessed what went into it and the discussions that we had over the last 2 years regarding this plan. And I would really urge whoever is making a decision as to what this guidance document looks like at the end, when everything is said and done, to take into account this new reality that we're in. No matter what detail you're working with, whether it's economic development or energy or land use, we are in a different environment, and I don't mean that just physically. I mean it economically. I mean, we just came out of dodging a bullet with this latest superstorm. So when you're talking fluvial erosion, let's, as a community, really keep this larger picture in mind. That's what I would urge. Because again, seeing how this document came together and all the different aspects and how everything is tied together as it is in our physical world, we really need to have that image of what we're moving into now is different from where we've ever been. So I would echo what Tim said, but just in a different way. It's not about big box stores, it's about everything. And so I would urge this body to really keep that in mind as you're looking at this document and the future of Brattleboro and the region.
Can I ask, can I query here? Ma'am?
Maggie?
I just had a question. Your point is very well taken. An excellent reminder that we have to think comprehensively and along a timeline. What I am not carrying away is a clear idea where you stand on that particular issue. Were you commenting on this 65,000 square foot rule, or were you just being broader in your?
I'm commenting on the comments that have been made up to this point on economic development and land use. Mm-hmm. And I'm urging, because I think you can get lost in the weeds, is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And I feel as though we as a community can do that very easily, and we often tend to, as humans, look to the past as a way to inform the future. And what I'm saying is, this isn't Kansas anymore. And so I would just urge the Select Board and the Planning Commission. I think this is a really good document. It may need tweaking, but I think it's at least projecting forward what our community may be dealing with as we go forward. And that includes the petroleum base that Tim Stevenson was talking about. That I think is eroding, and it just makes sense for a community like Brattleboro, which has so much going for it, to really take that into consideration as we look at how we want to develop and what kind of community we want to have in the future. And I consider Brattleboro my larger community because I live in a very small, as you know, community that doesn't have all of the services that Brattleboro has. So I consider Brattleboro, which is why I participated over the last 2 years in this advisory board.
But going to the core issue that David and I have been talking about is you're one of those people who takes it, you call this your home away from home, and you take advantage of all the services and all the things that are provided for here. And what, at the end of the day, the people in the community are suffering from a tax, from one of the highest tax rates in the state. And so looking at this document and looking at its future impact, I have to consider that. And looking back at the past and keeping the cookie cutter image that we might want to keep, that might not be the reality here, because only the people from the surrounding communities and very few people will be left here. Because I see our community shrinking. When I look at the population growth in the last 10 years, it's at, what, 0.1%? When I look at what has happened in my community in just the last 10 years, I'm not sure if I can afford to stay here much longer. A lot of people are feeling like that. not the people from Halifax and not the people from Dummerston and Marlborough and all the communities that have a much lower tax rate that come to Brattleboro and utilize the services and the facilities that we provide that are a great benefit.
I would also suggest to you that I come to Brattleboro and eat in Brattleboro, so
And thank you very much for
and I buy
that.
products. Well, I don't need to be thanked for it. I'm just saying that your point, I hear what you're saying. However, I also would say if you don't have people coming to the town that may or may not live here, you're going to suffer retail-wise, and restaurants and gasoline stations and all of the things you've mentioned. I, as a resident that lives in a town that is surrounded or that is outside of this community, might want to consider moving into Brattleboro. And yes, the taxes are very high. I certainly get your point. All I'm saying is, as this document is considered, and as we look forward, there are certain things, like it or not, in my view, that are not the same as they've been. And that if we want to address these issues, it may be creative is a word that I've heard several times tonight, just creative approaches to, not status quo, but creative approaches to what are the difficult challenges that we face as we go forward, and that is one of them.
And I
no
would agree
question.
with that last statement. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You did pay the out-of-town select board attendance fee, though, right?
This gentleman here, anyone who's already spoken will not get called on until everybody is done speaking.
I'm Jed Leslie from West Pratt. I wanted to comment on the population growth issue that everyone's talking about. I'm 32 years old. I moved here when I was 30. My wife was 28, 27 at the time. I grew up in Vermont, and like many young Vermonters, I left, got education, worked for a while in the city, and came back. I wanted to say that we picked Brattleboro very specifically because of some of the things that Dora mentioned. The arts, agriculture, farmers market, it's a big thing for us, and it's huge for us to find a community like this. We purposely moved to Brattleboro because of those specific things. Now, I would not move here because of Home Depot or because of Kohl's or any big box store that would show up. That's not a driving factor. The fact that Brattleboro isn't every town in the USA is what makes it appealing to young people. We like agriculture, we like arts, we like technology. I just think that should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Jed. Not yet, Tom. Anyone else?
May I add one thing?
Yes, you may.
I don't know how much people know about the zoning on Putney Road, but none of the zoning requirements that restrict these large businesses would be limited under this. It's only about an economic assessment. And when Walmart came in, there were many people who predicted that it would be the death of our downtown, and that was incorrect. And there's something indeed about Brattleboro that makes it different from the town in Texas that was brought up that seems to insulate us from that. And I would suggest to the public that an economic impact assessment requirement is not a cure. It will not say what Walmart will do to Brattleboro. It will say what one economist or a couple of economists think business X will do to Brattleboro. And I would be very surprised if everybody in here can say that economic predictions are even frequently accurate. And I would suggest further that the way to prevent large box stores from further degrading the appearance of Putney Road and the character of Putney Road is future zoning ordinances that are part of what we strive for in this larger town plan, but that this specific reduction in hardship does not undo everything else. And I think some people in the public saw that as contradictory. But we just, I think, didn't see the potential of it as being worth the hardship.
Dora?
I just want to say that it's been mentioned a couple of times that Home Depot failed. I mean, Home Depot failed for a number of reasons. There were a lot of people, first of all, who worked really hard to promote a buy local campaign. And they worked with Brown and Roberts, and they worked with downtown businesses, and I mean, you know, we probably had, you know, close to 100 people come into meetings at one point when they first started to come, and so there were a lot of people who worked really hard to promote local business and to get people to buy local. So it wasn't like they just sort of it happened because it could have gone the other way. They also left because of the economic collapse. I mean, that's what, you know, that's what precipitated their deciding to close that store, like they did many stores. And there were people who said, oh, it's going to be the death of downtown, but there were other people who were reading about it who said, in the box stores literature, they said that they need a population base of 50,000 in order to be able to survive. But if it's a business that has what they refer to as cannibalistic tactics, they might move into an area even though that store's not going to make any money to prevent other competitor box stores moving into an area. These are all things, we don't know what was going on in Home Depot's head, so we can't know these things. But to say that, to say that the businesses downtown came through it unscathed just because the population supported them, there was an effort to do that. And because of that, people realized the strength of our small businesses downtown. And in other places in town. We've got small businesses all over the place that are competitors.
Ken?
So I say this in an effort to move us on.
Why? Why? That's right.
Okay. But I'm going back because I'm just feeling incredibly dense because I feel like I'm still where I was an hour ago and not understanding how we've conflated these two things into one topic. And Tim got up here and eloquently, well, both Tims, of course, were eloquent, but Tim, the latter Tim, got up and spoke about box stores, and I understand all that, and I want to see some of those studies. But let me ask my very hopefully quick question first. Is the ordinance and I'm sorry for not knowing this, the ordinance is about 65,000 square feet? That's what's in the ordinance? Okay. Does the ordinance say box stores anywhere in the ordinance? Okay.
It says retail.
Right.
65,000 foot retail.
So I don't get this. There's a whole part of this conversation that I just don't understand, because I can't imagine that Tim, in everything that he said, would support a box store going into a 60,000 square foot retail space, which is a huge amount of space, which absolutely would support a box store. There are any number of box stores that are less than 65,000 square feet, but we're not talking about an ordinance that says box stores. And so there was something that Tom said earlier that I can't remember what it was, but know that I disagreed with it. That kind of mischaracterized what I was trying to say. All I'm trying to put out there is that I like calling a spade a spade. If we're having a conversation about box stores, then let's have a conversation about box stores and whether or not we want them in our community. That's not what this is. This is about 65,000 square feet, which of course can be equated to a box store, but so can 40,000 square feet. And as more and more of these businesses are using online retail space, virtual space, they don't need 65,000 square feet. So if we're having a real conversation about not having box stores, that's not what this is. Of course, if we say 65,000 square feet, and that's what the ordinance is against, I have absolutely no doubt that what we're talking about is box stores. But so too would be 40,000 square feet. So I'm just confused by this conversation just because it doesn't seem to be hitting the heart of what we're talking about. It's not called out, and the space being tied down to this one number for an economic assessment If we want box stores to do an economic assessment, then craft an ordinance that says box stores needs to do an economic assessment. Don't tie it to 65,000 square. Exactly, that's the point. Tying it to 65,000 square feet it should not be equated with. We have now captured the fact that all box stores need to now do an economic assessment, because that's not true.
So let me try and...
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I understand your issue, and I think that you're actually articulating one of the tensions that was present in the whole debate, and then, of course, turns up in the language of the ordinance. So there are federal constitutional issues around actually naming certain kinds of businesses in a derogatory fashion, such as big box or franchise, and there's freedoms and protections that are encoded in federal regulations, which means that a local community cannot explicitly say, we will not permit corporations who use yellow and red as their corporate signage to obtain a permit in our town. You cannot call out in such specific ways because it's an infringement on their rights under interstate business and a whole bunch of other provisions in the Constitution. So one of the problems that we've really actually got here is that an arbitrary number, 65,000 square feet, that is settled on, where the imputed negative economic and social impact is so large that people will find it disagreeable, and that stands in for the kinds of businesses that are known to occupy boxes that are 65,000 square feet or bigger. What we're trying to do in the town plan is to say, if you've got an issue with the shape or the colour or the shadow thrown by a big box that's got retail activity inside, or the way the stormwater is managed, or the parking is done, or the lighting is done, or how it faces the street, or all those kinds of things, which is typically the preserve of municipal land use controls, we're confident that we can institute design regulations that means that that building would be appropriate to the community's expectations and standards. What we're also saying is we don't feel we can engage in the kind of assessment that this ordinance calls for, which is to impose a restriction on a particular business with a particular size store in mind because of the expected economic and social impacts. And so there is something standing in here for something else. And the reason why it can't be spoken is that it's actually unconstitutional to speak those words in the ordinance.
This is like a Trojan horse in that.
Right. So
65,000 feet was always a proxy for big box stores as part in this discussion.
right. So it's a proxy.
I'm just saying it's not realistic anymore.
And so
It wasn't realistic then.
It's right. And so the general context for retail activity is such that the frequency with which large-scale retailers are even wanting to develop those sorts of stores is declining over time. So we think, in the broad sense, the community is less vulnerable or less threatened by this impact than we may have thought 10 years ago or 6 years ago when this rule was introduced. And then what we're saying is, if in the event that one of the existing retailers or another retailer of a similar nature feels like they need 65,000 square feet, the kinds of locally felt impacts from a land use standpoint, the Planning Commission is confident that they can write zoning regulations that would address that. The broader social and economic impacts, which we don't dispute and don't want to question, we feel would be more appropriately addressed in some other legal venue. And that's the precise point. What we know we can do, we're happy to do. What we know we'd have a really hard time doing anything with, we don't want to do. That's what the town plan basically says here.
Dora?
I just want to get back to the numbers issue, because the number was simply picked because they didn't want to say anybody that was already existing was out of compliance with an ordinance. Because they started at 50,000 and they kept raising it up, and the 65,000 came from figuring out what people were and adding a little bit in case somebody wanted to expand. So it is an arbitrary number. It's an arbitrary number that was a compromise that was sort of raised up from the 50,000, which is what the number that the research shows where you start to have an economic impact.
Right behind you, Tom.
She's so excited.
This is one of our planning commissioners.
Hi, Tim Leon. I'm actually on the planning commission from Brattleboro. And in doing this plan, we really realized the need to become more competitive as a community, both for lowering taxes and all of the things that come with making it easier to do business in town. We felt that that was very important. And I think the bottom line is that we really need jobs, and I don't condone big box stores either, but I would like to point out that the average Whole Foods is 45,000 square feet. So, I mean, it's one of those things that, you know, go big or go home. Should we lower it to 40,000 square feet? I mean, it's not black and white. It's very, it's a touchy subject, and I realize that we can't call it a big box store, but I think that we're all kind of in agreement that we want to keep our money locally, but we also need to make it affordable to live here. And in doing that, that means we need jobs, and we need to make it easier for developers to come in here and possibly tear up a piece of land within our urban growth boundary, of course, and make it easier for them to make a project, to bring in tax dollars, to provide jobs. It hasn't been happening, and living here for 4 years, I want to stay here, but it's very, very hard. Rent is ridiculous in this town to find a decent place to live, and it's just jobs and development on a variety of scales would do the town a lot of good. And I also want to say that I do feel like the economic development chapter was just a little bit passive. I feel like we tried to appease all of these different sectors and really didn't get into the meat of it. And Adam, I agree, Sursasima was great, and they've done wonderful things for the community, but what they're doing is fine, but I think we need to focus our attention on jobs that are more sustainable, that have lower environmental impact, tech jobs, jobs that attract people from all over the spectrum, and we didn't call that out in the plan, and I still feel like we should do that, specifically jobs in small offices, creative environments for the industries, and I think that's about it. So, thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Now, Tom. Oh, Mike, put your hand up. Well, I'll get you next, Mike.
Well, the other one was so old.
I just have a quick comment, not getting back into the debate. But I do need to take issue, David, with some of your comments, and that has to do with that it's political. What I can say is that the climate then was political. It was a hot issue as it is here tonight. No different. What I'm hearing is what you might call political differences, debates, heated views on both sides. That was the climate we're in. I just want for the record to say, however, that for 2 years in that climate, a subcommittee got together. I chaired that. We sat in that room, and we talked about this. And the people who knew us, some of you in this room, know that it was not known to be a polarized committee. Actually, there were people in that committee who had very different views. And it was objective, reasoned, and what's been happening here in the room, I'm telling you, didn't happen in that room. We studied, it was reasoned, it was not political, and I made sure of that as chair. I just want to say that. And that was our reputation. It might be forgotten now, but you ask people who knew us and talked to people in that subcommittee, that the work of that subcommittee was very well respected. And that's why the planning committee trusted us with our work. We can disagree with the particulars now. That's fine with me. But the process of that work was known at that time to be very good, if not a model of how to do business in this town. And it went through the planning committee, and it went to the select board, and we had meetings, and there was a lot of good discussion, and heated and so forth. We kept it even-keeled, reasoned, and objective all the way through, looking at the real issues out there, independent of all the feelings that were going on in the community. And that was a hard job.
But I think we did a really good job, and I hope, David, you might from the outside might not have seen that, but that's what was happening in that room. I just want to say that.
Mike?
Yeah, Michael Bosworth, West Brattleboro Association. Going to speak partly from the association viewpoint, but partly just as a personal.
Let me know when you switch over.
Okay.
And who's speaking first?
Well, from the West Brattleboro Association point of view, we're generally happy with the proposed plan. Personal point of view, I just want to compliment the quality of the plan. I think it's quite high. And also, from the West Brattleboro Association point of view, I want to thank the Planning Commission for including some stuff that we specifically requested when they came out to West Brattleboro. So thank you. We didn't have to wrestle with big box issues in West Brattleboro, but we certainly wrestled with chain store issues. And it turned out to be more complex than we thought. I mean, I certainly learned a lot. The fact that a franchise store that could be owned locally is different from one where the ownership is an absentee owner. There are different things that came into play. So I'm just bringing that up to sense.